Hey family, I hope you're standing strong today. Let me remind you of this simple yet powerful truth. There is absolutely nothing too hard for God. No situation is too complicated. No heart is too broken. No dream is too far gone. What seems impossible to us is effortless for Him. He spoke light into darkness, parted seas, and raised the dead. And He's still the same God today. So if you've been wondering whether things can change, let me tell you, God is not limited by time, resources, or circumstances. Stay with me, because we're about to dive into the unstoppable power of a God who never meets a challenge He can't overcome. Jeremiah 32:27 says, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? A question not meant to seek an answer, but to stir your spirit. Because the answer is a resounding no. We serve a God who split the Red Sea, who made water flow from a rock, who brought dry bones back to life. He is the God who shut the mouths of lions for Daniel and opened prison doors for Paul and Silas. And that same God, the God of wonders, the God of miracles, is still at work in your life right now. Maybe you're standing in the middle of a situation that feels unfixable. Maybe the doctor gave you a report that seems irreversible. Maybe the relationship feels unrepairable. But let me tell you something. Just because it's too hard for you doesn't mean it's too hard for God. Look at Hannah. She was barren, ridiculed by others, and year after year, it seemed like her prayers for a child were met with silence. But Hannah didn't stop praying. She didn't stop believing. And in 1 Samuel 1:20, it says, so in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. It didn't happen because Hannah had all the answers. It happened because God's power doesn't bow to human limitations. When we look at our problems, they seem big. But when we look at God, we realize how small those problems really are. Look at the story of Lazarus. In John 11, Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus that their brother Lazarus was sick, but Jesus didn't come right away. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. To everyone watching, the situation was hopeless. But Jesus didn't see death as the end. He saw an opportunity for God's glory. He stood before the tomb and commanded, Lazarus, come out. And a man who was dead and buried walked out alive. You may feel like something in your life is too far gone. Maybe a dream, a relationship, or even your hope. But let me tell you, God is in the resurrection business. Nothing is too hard for Him, not even raising what seems dead and gone. When we say there is nothing too hard for God, we have to realize what that truly means. It means there is no sickness He cannot heal, no heart He cannot mend, no situation He cannot turn around. God doesn't flinch at what scares us. He doesn't panic at what overwhelms us. The doctor's report doesn't shake Him. The unexpected loss doesn't surprise Him. God is unshaken, unmoved, and undefeated. His power is not dictated by the weight of your problem. It's only limited by whether or not you believe He can do what He said He would do. God's ability to do the impossible isn't tied to what we see. It's anchored in who He is. In Jeremiah 32:27, God says, I am the Lord, the God of all mankind. Is anything too hard for me? Notice how God doesn't ask if the problem is hard for you. He asks if it's too hard for Him. Because the truth is, nothing, absolutely nothing, can outmatch the power of God. What you're worried about today is already handled in God's plan. What feels too complicated is already unraveled by His wisdom. What seems impossible has already been worked out in His will. Sometimes, the reason we doubt God's power is because we try to fit him into our human understanding. We think, if I can't figure it out, then maybe God can't either. But let me remind you, God is not limited by human logic. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." What doesn't make sense to you is already aligned in God's divine plan. You may not see how the breakthrough will happen, but God doesn't need your understanding. He needs your trust. There is nothing too hard for God, but sometimes the hardest thing is for us to believe that. We carry the weight of our problems like we are the ones responsible for fixing them. But faith means surrendering control and trusting that God's power is greater than our struggle. When you stop trying to carry what only God can hold, you make room for his miraculous work in your life. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to trust the one who does. Let go of the timeline. Let go of the how. Let go of the fear. God's strength is made perfect in your weakness. Your impossibility is God's opportunity. The very thing you're worried about, the thing you've lost sleep over, is an invitation for God to show his glory. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army behind them, escape seemed impossible. But God didn't just make a way. He parted the waters, turning the sea into dry land. What looked like a dead end became a divine pathway. In the same way, God can turn your closed doors into open highways. What looks like a setback might just be a setup for God's supernatural intervention. Think about the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17. She was gathering sticks to prepare what she believed would be her last meal for herself and her son. Famine had hit the land, and all she had left was a handful of flour and a little oil. But then the prophet Elijah told her to make him a small loaf of bread first, and then promised that her flour and oil would not run out until the Lord sent rain. She obeyed, and God performed a miracle. The jar of flour was never empty, and the jug of oil never ran dry. The widow's situation seemed impossible, but when God steps in, the impossible becomes provision. No matter how little you have, God can multiply it. No matter how hopeless it seems, God can shift it. There is absolutely nothing too hard for God. Not now, not ever. The circumstances you face might look impossible, but God's power is not bound by human limits. When we look at the walls in front of us, the sickness, the financial struggles, the broken relationships, they might seem like immovable mountains. But God doesn't see the way we see. He sees through the mountain, beyond the wall, past the struggle, because he already holds the victory. Your situation may be too much for you, but it is never too much for the one who created the heavens and the earth with just his word. The question is never about God's ability. It's about whether you believe he is who he says he is. So today, stop telling God how big your problems are and start telling your problems how big your God is. Speak to that sickness and declare that nothing is too hard for God. Speak to that broken relationship and believe that nothing is too hard for God. Speak to that financial burden and trust that nothing is too hard for God. He's not asking you to figure it out. He's asking you to believe that he already has. This week, I want you to wake up every morning and declare, there is nothing too hard for my God. God isn't intimidated by what you're facing. He's not overwhelmed by your circumstances. He's the same God who spoke the universe into existence. And He's the same God who is speaking life into your situation right now. So hold your head high, pray bold prayers, trust with unshakable confidence, because there is nothing too hard for God. Let this be the week you stop shrinking your dreams to match your reality and start stretching your faith